Kate, and hello everybody. It's really amazing the technology that lets me sit here in New South Wales and beam in and see all of you guys in the room there down in South Australia. It's we're going to have a quick review of how to interpret your soil test this morning. And really from a holistic perspective, as Kate says, we work in the regenerative ag space and we use soil tests as part of the whole equation when we're looking at soil health. And I want to run you through my process that I use when I look at soil tests. I've probably fine-tuned this approach through working with soils fairly intensively over the last few years, working with Integrity Soils and Nicole Masters. Some of you may have read Nicole's book. If anyone wants to put their hand up and let me know if you've read For the Love of Soil by Nicole Masters. No, I don't see any. If you haven't, highly recommended book on soils. It'll get you fired up and it'll give you a lot of background on what I talk about today. It's available on audiobooks and ebooks, and you can buy a hard copy as well. So that one is a good read if you want to get a handle on looking at your soil health in a holistic biological way. I might share my screen with you all, make sure that's all working. And I'm assuming everyone can hear me loud and clearly. I'm sure Kate will let me know if you can't. But so yeah, we're going to look at how we interpret a soil test for a regenerative outcome. You're not going to just get from me how much fertiliser to put on. I'm not saying fertilisers aren't useful, but we look at this in a very different way to, I guess, the way agriculture has approached soil tests for many, many years. If you, before I get into that, this is pretty much part of what we do at Reinventing Ag, which is our business now. We really harness three main areas of farm business management to help build resilient businesses. So I just wanted to let you know, I'm a pretty holistic person. It can confuse people, but we've had a lot of experience with the soil health component, which we're talking about today. But alongside that, we work with the people and the profit to help make resilient businesses, and they all go together. So part of the reasons I'm very passionate about soil health is because I've seen time and time again how important healthy soils are for having viable, profitable businesses and healthy people. So it's all connected, and that's really, I guess, the basis of this approach. When I talk healthy soils, I look at a soil that will look a lot like this beautiful image in the picture here. If only we all probably look at that, and it looks like chocolate cake almost, doesn't it? It's beautiful. It will hold and release nutrients. It will hold and release water, have good structure to allow good airflow through the soil. It'll be full of life, lots of microorganisms, billions of them would be in this soil when it's healthy. When it is in that state, it protects our plants against pests and animals against pests and diseases. It can detoxify and decompose residues. It can help us deal with changeable climates, but it's also full of all sorts of other secondary metabolites, plant growth hormones, enzymes, all sorts of goodies that help us to grow nutrient-dense crops. So we're looking at our soil test in relation to a healthy soil being like this. All of this means resilience, productivity, healthy animals, healthy plants, reduced input costs, and more profit in your bank account. So that's what it's all about when we talk about soils. We also can restore our water cycles. We all know we can sequester carbon in our soils. Generally, that's getting pretty trendy at the moment as well. But there's so many reasons. There's not much the soil health won't contribute to. And so I'm going to encourage you today to look at your soil in a way, and these soil tests in a way to help you see how healthy your soil is, rather than just what inputs do we need to use. So today there's three, I've kind of got three little points in our journey for the next hour. First is like, what do these numbers mean? I think honestly, reading soil tests is like riding a bike. You only learn to do it by doing it. You can't watch someone read a soil test and be right, I'm ready to go. Just like you can't watch someone ride a bike and be ready to go, or, that kind of thing. So it's really a practice. And I can relate to looking at soil tests and not understanding anything. And this was even after I had a uni degree in ag, being a farmer, worked with farmers for years. I only really got good at this by doing it. So be patient with yourself. And the reason we're going to work through these results today, Kate's got some handouts that we did with the numbers on it. So you can work through the process with me. And then this being recorded, you can then get your own soil tests and review this process and look at your own soil tests and what the numbers mean. So it's really about the practice of it, and recognizing the more you do this, the better you'll get. We'll also look at how these soil tests play a role in a regenerative farming system. And I'm going to run you quickly through at the end the soil decision-making process that we have used since working with Nicole Masters at Integrity Soils to help us use these in a holistic way and put first things first in getting our soil health back up and running. So that's what we're in for. But first, what do the numbers mean? So this is my process. This is how when I get a soil test, this is how I go through it and run through it. We generally use a different lab for our clients' soil tests. However, some clients, if they've already got a lot of soil tests, we're not there to spend all their money on testing if we can use the soil tests they've got. And for you guys, you've got some soil tests done, so we're working with what you have today. We generally use EAL labs in Lismore. They're not, and SWEP, I think, is not a fertiliser company either. Generally stay away from fertiliser company labs, but EAL's test tells us a few different things that aren't on your test today. And you have a couple of things on your test that I don't usually use. So it's interesting, and being adaptable is part of the process. But overall, the main numbers mean the same things, whatever lab you use. And it's really important, if you've been soil testing for a long time, that you keep labs consistent. You don't chop and change all the time, because while they're all accredited and meet certain standards, they'll have slight nuances in their calibrations and things. So, you know, the best results over time are using the same labs over time. So find a lab you like and stick with it if possible. You know, obviously sometimes we change, but yeah, that's a really good idea if you're going to do this for the long term. The first thing I look at on your soil test, now I've taken off the interpretations that some of you, when you've had Rebecca look at them, she's put some notes on there because I want you to interpret this yourself. So you'll notice that will be blanked out in all my slides, but I've just taken a screenshot here of the soil tests that we've got. We're using an example today, so thank you very much for that example. I've just got to remember the name. I've got the wrong one now. Craig, wasn't it? Yes, Craig. Thank you, Craig, for letting us run through yours as an example today. And you know, so you get to run through. Everyone will get to run through yours and then go and do their own. But it's a really good to have one there in the room that I can ask you a few questions about what you're seeing in the physical aspects of your soil health, what weeds are growing and things. So in the Q&A, I might mention a few things that I'm wondering about as we go through these results. And then when we stop for questions and answers, I might get Craig to let me know some of my answers to my questions about this soil as well. So we'll work through that as well. The first thing I look at when I pick up someone's soil test is organic carbon or organic matter. I don't look at anything before I look at that. It is the number one most important thing in your soil to me. This is because, and in this instance, they've given us a reading for organic carbon. Sometimes we get organic matter or organic carbon, and they're related. There's a formula coming up on a slide, and you can have a copy of all these slides, so you don't have to write down all the formulas today. I'll certainly pass that on to everybody as well to have a copy, but these are interrelated. And so I'm just going to let you know, the reason I look at soil organic matter first is because it is the essence of healthy soil. It holds the soil biological, physical, and chemical health together. It's a measure in the lab of all the organic substances in your soil, the living and dead organic material. That will include plant roots, algae, microbes. It's sort of anything living. It includes plant exudates and all of the fresh and decomposing organic matter in the soil. When they give you a lab reading, you're getting soil carbon, which is, you know, some labs give us soil organic matter. If you ever see a lab test with that, you know that that's approximately 58% carbon, and you can convert between the two. So sometimes you'll see different references to either organic matter or carbon, and this formula helps you make sense of both of them. So that's just there because different labs report it differently. But it is the life force in your soil, and that's why I look at it. I want to see, you know, how's this soil traveling? How much life is in it? Some of the cropping soils I've looked at have very little organic matter or carbon left in them. And that means that they are not doing the job of providing plant available nutrients, storing water. They're not providing a home for microbiology, as we've got on my list here. Soil organic matter is also this amazing insulator in the soil. It's like an insulative blanket that creates a hospitable environment for soil biology to live in and for the life in the soil to function and for the plant roots and everything. And I've noticed in soils that don't have organic matter, the soil temperature basically follows the air temperature because there's no insulation. In a healthy soil full of decomposing and cycling organic matter, and when the system's healthy, that soil will buffer temperatures, so it'll stay warmer in winter and cooler in summer. It's also really important for this microbial workforce. As I said, it's their home. Graham Sate had some figures that he claims that if you've got a soil that is 2.3% carbon or 4% organic matter, you'll have a more healthy microbial workforce. But once we get below 0.9% carbon or 1.7% organic matter, you're going to have very little life. It's lifeless, and you'll often find pest and disease issues. So when I looked at some of the tests Kate sent me, the organic matter levels were quite good. And it was interesting on Craig's test, it was quite high. I think you had an organic carbon of 4.51, which then if you use that formula I just gave you back here, says your organic matter is about 7.7%. However, if you have a good number, that's not all there is to it, because it's never quite that simple. Sometimes, because as I said, we're measuring all of the plant material in the soil. If there's thatch in the soil, if there's undecomposed organic matter, if the decomposition processes in your soil aren't working, which we need for soil health, that can make our organic matter readings quite high. It can also be when we sample, if we're sampling a bit inaccurately and not scraping off some of the plant material above the soil. So we've got to look at all of this alongside the actual physical health soil, that, dig a hole, look at the paddock, look at what's going on to get a feel for this organic matter reading a lot of the time, because, it could be that it's not functioning or there's undecomposed organic matter. So yeah, that's the sort of thing I'll be asking Craig at the end to say, is there any, is there a lot of plant litter on the surface? What's going on? Because that's the sort of stuff we need to look at alongside. It's good to have a good number, but we want to make sure it's cycling through the system as well. And organic matter, as I said, it's the essential piece in having a healthy soil in every aspect. It holds your physical health together. It's the glues that help build beautiful structures. It's the home for the biology, and it stores minerals and nutrients. So it's really important. And this little diagram, I think, shows you how it works in every aspect of healthy soil. It's providing all sorts of benefits to your soil as far as the biology, physical structure, and chemistry. So, for me, that's the first thing I look at. I really want to know, okay, how's it going? And I was quite alarmed. I taught whole farm planning courses in my local area for about 3 years. And I used to I've been a bit passionate about soils for a very long time. And I used to ask all my groups of farmers who knew how much soil organic matter or soil carbon they had in their soils. And over that time, working with many, many, many farmers in my district, I only had one farmer who could tell me how much soil organic matter his soils were running at. And, for me, that's probably more important than how much fertilizer to put on, is how healthy is my soil, how much organic carbon have I got, and this is the reason why. So have a look and learn, and if this is something that you're going, I've never really thought about it, it's something to make a note to learn more about and get more interested in. It will make a huge difference to your bottom line. Nutrient values for soil organic matter in America, they put a value of about $680 an acre on a percentage of soil organic matter. But forgetting that, 1% of soil carbon holds 144,000 litres per hectare of water. And we're no strangers in Australia to extreme droughts, extreme floods, all of these things going with their planet and climate. If we want to have a more resilient business, we want to get more of the rain that falls on our land. And soil organic matter is how we capture more rain, how we become more rainfall use efficient. And, this is going to do this for you once it's there. So it makes a huge difference in profit. There's actually been a lot of work done on soil organic matter by Dr. Christine Jones, And I would encourage you, if this is piquing your interest in this today, to Google Dr. Christine Jones. Her website is called Amazing Carbon. You can read a ton of really, really good papers on this. But, you know, her work has shown that we've lost between 50 and 80% of the organic carbon in our soils in Australia since European settlement. Obviously, that's costing us a lot of money in production and environmental health and human health. It's huge. It's also, you know, that whole ecosystem function and just helping us, our agricultural landscapes function better, and we've lost it. And we haven't done this intentionally. It's been an unintended consequence of industrial farming systems. And I think the reason it's happened, and it's kind of happened without us realizing it till we get to a point of crisis, is that we have focused purely on chemical soil tests for a very long time and just said, okay, this is my chemistry, what fertilizer do I put on? And we haven't looked at the physical soil health and the biological soil health alongside that. So we have this unintended consequences, of which this is one. But most importantly to me is I've always seen the link between soil carbon and profit. But there's been studies done now that back up what I kind of knew was there, but it's good to see someone scientific also putting some numbers around this. And they did some studies to show that soil organic matter is a more important driver of farm profit than yields, because it's holding nutrients, it's creating a healthier water cycle, it's giving you more rainfall use efficiency, it's storing all that water. So it's really, really important to look at this and start to manage for it. And the more you focus on it, the more you can improve it. So it's just becoming aware. I could talk about soil carbon all day, but we're not here to just do that. One thing I'll say, if you're looking at your soil carbon, and I've inspired you to get really conscious about this, there's two main carbon cycles in your soil. Christine Jones writes a lot about these on her website, Amazing Carbon, and this diagram's from Nicole Masters' book, For the Love of Soil, that I mentioned before. And there's the decomposition pathway of carbon cycling through the system, where crop residues break down and are cycled back through the soil. There's also what's called the liquid carbon pathway. And this is where photosynthesizing plants drip sugars that they create through photosynthesis down into the soil. They feed biology, and this becomes stable forms of carbon in the soil. It's actually between 5 and 6 times more quicker to sequester carbon and rebuild soil organic matter through the liquid carbon pathway than it is through the decomposition pathway. So to improve carbon, the only way to do it is through living, growing plants. So it's harnessing that free energy from the sun, photosynthesizing plants, and getting carbon back through growing plants. It really is essential. If we don't have growing plants all the time, we have this periodic build-up of carbon in the soil. But then when the plants go away, all the biology that lives in the soil needs a source of energy, and they will use that carbon up to survive. So I've got farmers that have been doing all these really good things about cutting back chemical inputs, cutting back synthetic fertilizers, and using really friendly fertilizers. And the carbon wasn't moving, but each year they had a dead fallow. And because they'd have all this good stuff happening and then they'd have no plants growing, the soil carbon just couldn't shift long term. So if we want to improve it, we need to grow plants, and the plants will rebuild our soil. So that's something to think about and learn more about if this is something that you're looking at these numbers, or you're looking at your own soil test beside it and going, oh, I need to look at this. Think about the liquid carbon pathway. The second thing I look at when I look at a soil test is cation exchange capacity, which is this little number here. It tells me a lot about what your soil is doing. So for me, it's like the size of the soil. In this instance, in Craig's results, it's 14.48 is the cation exchange capacity. I was a little challenged when I saw on the desired levels greater than 6, because cation exchange capacity is an inherent property of your soil. The only way you can change it is by adding organic matter, because it also has an ability to improve this. But otherwise, it's really changed your postcode, because our soil's properties like sand, silt and clay are a huge part of this. But I also get the reason for the desired levels is when we have low soils, we want to get enough organic matter in to get it up as high as we can. So I'm just sort of going, oh, that's interesting. But I generally go, it's an inherent characteristic. And the reason I say that is because it's a measure of the positive, as I said, it's like the size of your soil, but it's about the positive charges on the colloids that can hold cations. So calcium, magnesium, potassium and sodium, hydrogen and aluminium are cations that these negative charge sites will hold on to, okay? And these are the cations that we want to exchange. So if you have the positive charges, aluminium, calcium, mag, potassium and sodium are all alkaline and lift pH, which is why we often use lime and things like that. But hydrogen and aluminium will often be more related to soil acidity, okay? So there's just the different types of cations on this site, but it's really about how many sites does my soil have to hold and exchange cations. Clay soils have really high CECs. I've seen soils up to 60, really those deep Darling Downs kind of really heavy clay soils. I've seen soils as low as 2, and they're really sandy, light soils. Typical sandy soils are often around the 5 or 6 stuff. When I started working with Integrity Soils, them being New Zealand based, their soil calculators didn't go beneath 6. And I'm like, hang on a minute, here in Australia, we have a lot of soils under 6. We have a lot of the granite soils around where I live are about 5, so they're quite, it's a measure of size. And the organic matter also has, like clay soils have a lot of these sites where they can exchange cations, but organic matter also does. So it's a really good way when we have light soils, we need to really foster that organic matter to improve the ability of our soil to hold and exchange nutrients as well. This little diagram shows you, I guess, a little bit of the difference between a sandy light soil has less sites to hold on to cations with a high sea soil's got many, many, many more sites on those charges. And sand is a much bigger particle than a clay particle. And so, when we have a sandy soil, if we were to put all those particles end on end on end and line them up, they would take up a lot less space than a clay soil, because the clay particles are tiny, but they have a lot more surface area to hold and exchange nutrients. So that's just to sort of give you that indication of the size of our soil. And some typical CEC ratings for different types of soil textures. So light sandy soils, like I said, are often less than 5. Our loamy soils, our silt loams, our clays, and I haven't seen that, peat soils here in Australia. I haven't worked with any, but I know in New Zealand they see them a bit over there. But like I said, the really heavy clays I've seen are commonly around 40. But one was up to 60, and it's got a lot of inherent fertility, but sometimes you can hold all those cations, but they're not always available. They can be bound quite tightly. So, when we have a light soil, we have less surface area. Honestly, we shouldn't be if we're throwing huge rates of fertilizer at really small soils, there's nothing to hang on to it. And we've got to realize that if our soil's lighter and smaller, less is more, but, little applications of fertilizer more often, because we just don't have the ability to hold on to it. We could be just throwing nutrients that are just going to leach away. But the beauty of these smaller soils is we can, correct imbalances more quickly as well. So they have that benefit. A clay soil will have a lot more sites, but it can take a lot more time and money to balance. And it may not be a financial economic thing to try and, it's like, we'll get into this in a minute about aiming for perfect numbers. Sometimes aiming for perfect numbers, particularly on those big soils, can take a lot of money, and it uses quicker ways to get a healthy soil than aiming for perfect numbers on soil tests. So just being mindful that the different characteristics and understanding that also helps me to interpret and look at the right recommended rates of the desired levels of nutrients in the soil tests, which has been provided to you guys. EAL Labs has a little sheet with the different CCs and the different desired levels, so you can interpret using that. But if labs don't give you that, you've got to rely on the levels they give you. But if there's desired levels on our example soil test today, and I've also added a couple in there which I'll talk about later, they are for this CEC for this soil we're working on. Don't assume them across every soil type, because they're going to operate differently. But that's why I look at CEC. I want to know how big the soil is. I want to know the characteristics of the soil. And remember, it's a reserve, but it doesn't mean things are available. No numbers are perfect unless all numbers are perfect. So if you're not, you'll hear me say this a lot, we're not aiming for perfect soil test numbers. And particularly when it comes to these ones, the second thing I often look at is our base. It's called base saturation. Base saturation is where there's these percentages of CEC here that you'll be given on soil tests and tell you how much of those exchange sites are taken up with calcium, how much are taken up with magnesium, potassium, sodium, and aluminium. How much space are they taking up? When I add up these percentages, we get 100. So we can see that all the sites on this soil are full of nutrients. They're holding onto all these nutrients. There's not a lot of space there. If we were going to add more fertilizer, where's it going to go? So we look at that to see how much room there is in the soil. These numbers are an indication, but they're just part of the equation. This soil test gives you the cation exchange capacity. There's also some results for exchangeable calcium, and here, there's a few numbers here they haven't given you desired levels for. So I've actually looked at this one here when we get to looking at our elements and found you some desired levels. However, they're based on this CEC, so don't use them for your soil tests if you're not Craig, okay? It's based on the cation exchange capacity of Craig's soil. So yeah, we look at these numbers next, and the calcium magnesium ratio. So if you've found those on your sheet, these were sort of created by Albrecht, who studied a lot of things around plant and animal health. And he noticed there was a desired range of cations in this, CEC filled with these bases where animals were happier and healthier. And he found these ranges of the cations that I've got listed here on this slide. Okay. But healthy soils do not say, they don't wait to be healthy until they have all those desired levels. A healthy soil is healthy for a number of reasons. And I'll say that pretty passionately because we've been lucky enough to work with lots of different soils over the last few years. And we were working in a dairy project in Victoria back in the day when we could go from New South Wales to Victoria. And we were, one of the dairy farmers in the project had been on a biological path for about 15 years. And his soil was beautiful. He'd been fostering soil health rather than looking at soil, and he hadn't been looking at soil tests and putting lots of inputs. He'd been fostering soil health in a very, very holistic way. So we dug holes, we looked at his soil and everything else, and we took some soil tests while we were there. And when we got the soil test back, we got home, I nearly fell over because when I saw the numbers, and particularly some of those calcium, the magnesium was really high, the sodium was high, but his soil was physically very healthy. And what it proved to me was that when we bring our soil back to life, the numbers can be mediated by the biology, so if I was just looking at the numbers, I would have been really concerned, and I would have made recommendations that weren't appropriate in his soil conditions at all, because the soil was very healthy. It's just that the biology and the life in the soil could mediate those imbalances. So it's being mindful. These are guides, and these can give us insights into levers to pull. But if we're trying to make these numbers perfect, we can go broke in the process, and that's not my goal for you. So be mindful of that is my biggest message. These are the ideals, okay? But they're just a guide. They're good to know, but they're just a guide. So these slides you will keep, if we have around those percentages, we're pretty happy, but again, being mindful of taking into account the whole picture and our observation of that soil as well. We also look at the calcium magnesium ratio, because when we have it in those ideal ratios, we're less likely to see soil compaction, because calcium flocculates the soil, where magnesium tightens it up and it makes it very hard and tight, So in high clay soils, we often have a lot of magnesium and very tight soils. But yeah, if we can get that right, we often have better flocculation, better structure, better airflow. However, in many, many cases, trying to adjust it with inputs can leave farmers out of pocket quite a lot. And there are sometimes ways we can build those properties we're seeking using biology and using plants instead of lots and lots of inputs. But yeah, these give us the ideals in that range. And this is just, when we have that range, compaction isn't as likely. Again, it's like, look at, every soil will be different. Some will be economical to tweak and some it won't be. But you've really got to understand your budget and the other ways you can get to the same result. In a high calcium soil, we'll have good flocculation, which creates more of a crumb-like structure. When we don't have that, we'll have that plate-like aggregation, which we often see in those tight, high mag soils. We also can see that soils can disperse and fall apart when those numbers aren't right. So this is one of Nicole Masters' diagrams on that flocculation and how those particles work with the different calcium to magnesium ratios. But what I really want you to understand is we can't buy soil structure in a bag. Like, we can tweak things, but it's ultimately our management of the chemical, biological and physical health that's going to address the soil compaction issue. So, it's the physical health, it's the minerals do come into it, but there's also biology and how we manage that soil. So it's really important to remember those aspects when we're looking at those ratios particularly. The other ratio in that base saturation that's really worth looking at is the potassium to sodium ratio. The reason I always look at that one is because if they are quite similar, they both have two positive charges, these little elements. And if sodium's there excessively, plants might mistake it and take it up instead of potassium. And that's going to reduce our production and have issues in our system. So, just being aware of that and making sure that those, there's always, if we have more sodium than potassium, it's wise to address it, and make sure we're doing things about it in our management strategies to help improve the production and the health of the system. The next thing I look at is the pH, which is that measure of the soil's alkalinity or acidity, but it's so often we address pH with lime, and lime is calcium carbonate. But guess what? pH is not a function of calcium. And we'll learn more about that in a minute. Calcium can shift it through, looking at how it's an alkalizing element on that exchange sites, but pH is actually not that. You can see Craig's results here for pH. It's a slightly acidic soil. So that's telling us that. I think also this lab's given you a pH, a water test and a calcium carbonate test. They're just different ways they've measured this, different ways of extracting and measuring pH. Generally, I think in your soils, in this soil test, the pH, the calcium chloride one's probably the best one to look at. It's more reliable on an acidic soil, and it is slightly acidic. But I want you to realise that soil pH is not a function of calcium, as I said. It measures acidity, but it's a result of all the interactions going on in the soil. It's particularly, biology is particularly important in this. There's also chemistry at play. All of the rest of those things are all impacting pH, but it's actually measuring the negative log of the hydrogen ion. And it's not actually measuring calcium. However, we can shift it with calcium, but that's not the cause of pH issues. So, that's where we can get caught up in a high calcium input system to try and move pH. It's very expensive, but there could be other ways we could attack this issue as well. When we think of pH, that's just a general pH chart saying, really alkaline things up here, really acidic things down here. A healthy pH for soil, plants, animals, and us humans is about 6.4. And it's amazing. It's across the board. That's a pretty good pH to be running at, actually, which I find fascinating. I learned that from Graham State, and it never left me because I was so fascinated by the fact they're all, the ideal, if we want a perfect number, is 6.4 for everything living. So that was really interesting. You probably might have seen this soil pH chart before. I know I learned this at uni many, many years ago, and how, pH can influence the availability of all those minerals and, the chemical minerals in your soil. And different pH ranges are ideal for different elements, that kind of thing. What's really interesting, and what I've learned working with integrity soils particularly, is that while this does come true in an inorganic conventional farming model where we've taken life out of our soils and they've become an input treadmill. When we bring biology into the equation, this doesn't necessarily ring true. Okay, so once that happens, this graph's not necessarily true. It's in a lab and in a sterile soil where we're not accounting for biology and life, yes, it's very true. But once we start to work with biology, we can throw some of these assumptions out the window, which is pretty cool. And Nicole Masters teaches that, you know, our pH range, we can buffer up to 2 points of pH once we get the health of our biological system working better. So that's really, really, it gives us an inkling as to how we can shift things without just lots and lots of calcium. And if you've been putting lots and lots of lime on and it's still going through the same system every couple of years, they're saying put more on, you're not addressing the cause of pH, you're addressing this symptom. You know, it's like it will, if we've taken the life out of the equation, it's going to improve the availability of nutrients, but it's not addressing the cause, which is often that we've accidentally killed off a lot of the biology that help us with these things. So these are plant roots with healthy rhizome sheaths that have a huge amount of biology and protection around those roots. And, you know, I want you to go home and start digging up plants and looking to see if you find rhizome sheaths, because when you do, they're helping to buffer that pH. They're providing that protection around the roots for those plant roots to, you know, deal with things and moderate the pH environment. So they're vital. This was an example of some soil pH changes with the pH chart here that were, first remediating soils with biology and humic acids and dropping the pH from 8.5 to 6, which is much more favourable for plants just through those kinds of things. But yeah, just being mindful, like it's not, we've noticed our soils were acidic and our pH rose over time without any lime, without any inputs, just through bringing life back into the soil using grazing management and having a healthy soil biology as a result of healthier plants. Over time, we've noticed our pH increasing without doing anything else. So it's something to watch and take note of. The next thing I look at is probably, you'll notice I'm not going how much fertilizer to put on yet. I'm looking at the characteristics of the soil. I'm looking at EC. And in these tests, we don't generally measure ECE, the one on the bottom here. We always look at EC. And I don't look at that freaking out about salinity. I look at EC to see if there's energy in the system, because we actually need energy. And so most of the soils I look at have none. We want to see actually this EC rating, we want that to be greater than 0.2. And I don't see many soils over that. We don't want it too high. We don't want it over 0.6, but under 0.2, our engine in the soil is struggling. This is the energy. It's once we get over 0.6, it's running too fast and we start to see lots of issues there. But, if it's really, really high, it can be an indication of salinity. But you guys also have this test to indicate salinity, the ECE, which I'll get onto in a minute. So yeah, we want to see some energy in these systems. When we have a really low EC or a high EC, humates are an amazing product. They're a carbon source that can help lift or drop these ECs when we're out of range. So that's a really nice input when we've got that issue. But yeah, I've seen soils with such flat batteries that we've actually had to use some synthetic fertilizers because they just had no energy at all, no spark. So that's why I look at that, which is often different to what a lot of people do, freaking out about salinity. But when you have this reading, which you guys have on your test, you can see how much of a salinity issue you're dealing with in your soil. So on these tests we're using, we actually were in the pretty good range. So, we had no issue with salinity. If you do have a higher rating on that test, then I'd encourage you to look at the best plants for that situation while you mitigate it. Growing plants that are well adapted to that salt level will be a best way to help move the system through that. The other thing that I look at next, and I probably would have looked at it before actually with the organic matter reading, if it was on your test, which it's not, is the carbon to nitrogen ratio. This tells me if that carbon in your soil is functional. A healthy soil with a good decomposition cycle, it'll be between 10 to 1 and 12 to 1. And if it's, sometimes we see really high carbon levels, but are really, it's like 16 or something, or 20, or maybe, 16 is common on a soil that's not decomposing. So that's one I really like to have, to give me that inkling of the decomposition cycle in the soil. And is carbon functional? Is biology working? Those kinds of things. And it's not on these tests, but I have to mention it, because that would be what I'd be wondering about with those pretty good carbon readings, is to see how this was situated. But just so you know, it's something you can test for. And it is an option in some places. But after I go through all of those characteristics, I've built in my mind a bit of a soil character, I guess. What's this soil looking like, and what is it functioning like? What size is it? Was there a good organic matter level, that kind of thing? The next thing I do is then start to look at the desired levels of nutrients. I'll just go back here. Oh, no, I won't. I'm skipping through too quickly. So, you've got on your soil test, and we'll work through those now, the desired levels of nutrients and the different results that you're getting. So that's the next thing I do. But keep in mind, this is a Mulder's chart, and it's just to remind us that there's a lot of interactions happening between all these elements on your soil test. Some of them are antagonistic towards each other, and some of them actually boost each other along and stimulate. So being mindful of this, it's like, the minute you add one thing, you're impacting everything else. They're all connected. Everything's connected, okay? So this is a really good reminder. And sometimes if there's something out of whack, this chart can remind us of why it could be so. Something else could be contributing to that. So it's just worth knowing about this chart, and something I will consult in diagnosing soils and strategies and things like that. The first nutrient I tend to look at is nitrogen. Now, it's one most of us are pretty familiar with nitrogen. It's it's something that we know. It's most commonly applied fertilizers, probably nitrogen fertilizers like urea. But I look at the soil test to see, with nitrogen, it tells me how much air we've got in our soil, because nitrogen is related to aeration, okay? I don't say, oh, do we need to put it on? I go, what's going on with the nitrogen cycle? And they haven't given you a desired ratings here for, I should have put ammonium in, sorry, I forgot to look that one up, but it's quite low and your nitrate's quite high. And that's already telling me a lot about the soil biology in your soil. It's telling me that I believe there's a fairly good chance there's a bit of compaction happening in this soil, because ammonium is a biological form of nitrogen that's often relying on the soil biology to fix it. But also when the nitrate gets high, we'll often see nitrogen weeds like nightshade, capeweed, nettles, fat hen, milk thistles. Those type of weeds love high nitrates in the soil, and it's a switch for a lot of weeds that come in to mop it up. It's also a sign that protozoa in our soil, who depend on soil bacteria to live and eat, thrive, they often cycle the nitrogen in the system, may be absent. And when we lose protozoa, their bacteria die off and that nitrate gets released, and it's not cycled through the system by the protozoa and the nematodes that cycle in the soil food web. So it's giving me an indication there's some biological imbalances and maybe lack of aeration. And there could be some weeds, which Craig can tell me later, and see if we're onto that. It's not necessarily so, but these are the things I look at. After our property burnt in a fire, we had a pretty extreme drought, and everything just was pretty apocalyptic, as you guys are no strangers to these things either down there. And we had all this nightshade weed come up, and we'd never seen it in 15 years here, never seen nightshade weed here at all. And it just came up everywhere. And for me, it was the fact the soil food web had taken a hammering, and we had no protozoa, and the bacteria in our soils, which are always there, that's just different, sometimes in quite low numbers, but they're generally always there, had died off, and there was no life to cycle that through the system. Here we were with all these nitrate weeds. So it was a real indication of the soil food web. The reason I link it to air is because nitrogen is basically it's a biological cycle in nature. So it's not in nature, there's animal residues and there's different things that come into the system, but it is a biological system, okay? And it's generally low when we've got those things out of whack. And that's why I look at the biology when I see it. But also, we've got all this nitrogen above us in the air, 74,000 tonnes of nitrogen above every hectare. And we're applying it out of a bag because we've lost the air in our soil and we've lost the biology in the soil that fix the nitrogen out of the air. One of the things that I just think I get gobsmacked about constantly is when I was studying ag at uni and at school and, all the rest of it, all we talked about was rhizobium fixing nitrogen, but there's actually all this other biology in our cells, a lot of free living bacteria that also fix nitrogen as well. And no one talks about them, but they're definitely there. And so when we can bring the air and the life back in our soil, we can start to use nitrogen for free. So, that's a pretty exciting concept. It takes time to get there, and we can't always turn off the nitrogen tap instantly, or we crash our system, because we do have to juggle this transition very carefully. But there's a lot of potential there, and that's what I see there. The nitrogen cycle is really closely entwined with the carbon cycle. This is a diagram I stole from RCS, which is, I thought, was a brilliant description of that linkage between the two. And one of the reasons we've lost all the carbon in our soils because we haven't managed the nitrogen inputs well. And even if we're using manures and things, they can be creating the same problems as urea. So we have to be really mindful of how we apply nitrogen, because when we do, we feed the bacteria in the soil, they build up in numbers. And then if they run out of a food source, they'll chew up our carbon to stay alive, and we'll accidentally take out the carbon that is there. So there's these unintended consequences. That's a very basic description of a very complex thing, but we need to be mindful of how nitrogen is affecting carbon. And we would generally put carbon sources with any nitrogen inputs, but we tend to like to try and gradually use a bit more foliar so we don't create this dynamic in our soil where we lose our carbon. So just, be mindful of that. And when we start to look at nitrogen, again, I'd never say someone go cold turkey on any form of nitrogen input, because you can crash your system and we want you to make money. But you can gradually get off that treadmill by looking at biology, addressing compaction, looking at, crop residues, and also cobalt and molybdenum, which are not tested in your soil tests, but we need cobalt and moly to fix nitrogen. Those free living bacteria rely on those trace elements to do the nitrogen fixing. So you want soil tests that can give you some ratings on these guys, because they're often dragging the system of getting free nitrogen back in. Okay, so that's one thing that I was not in those soil tests that I would like to see. Okay, so that's one thing that I was not in those soil tests that I would like to see in soil tests for that reason. So and then I look at phosphorus, because it's another big input. And I've just got the stars, as you probably noticed, where I'm looking on these tests as we go. Phosphorus, and you look at your desired readings over here, it's a bit low. Now, I don't go, you need to put more phosphorus on automatically. We may need to address it, just like we may need to address the nitrogen. But phosphorus low tells me that we most likely also have some biological health issues to address, which is common. It's often the case in our soils, because we don't know what we don't know about soil biology. It's this whole new frontier and so much to learn, and there's so much we don't know about it. But we know that mycorrhizal fungi will be a big source of how they can go out into the soil and bring in the phosphorus the plants need. Phosphorus fertilisers lock up really, really quickly. So, there's it's a tricky one to manage, and it's become quite a lot of inputs in phosphorus, terms of phosphorus, but then a lot of us locked up. They are testing Colwell-P. There's actually a range of soil tests that you can use for phosphorus. Colwell-P is a measure that was generally quite about fertiliser inputs. It is about that level responds quite well to fertilisers, and different phosphorus lab tests can deal with different pH levels better. So the one we use has a few different types of phosphorus tests on it to give us a few different indications, because phosphorus is tricky. It locks up quickly, and it's, the lab tests are there's a range of things that work in different conditions better. So this soil, coal or pea is what we've got to look at. It's telling us there's not a lot there. But again, when I see low nitrogen, I see lack of air. When I see low phosphorus, I see lack of fungi, because we haven't often got the mycorrhizal fungi doing that job for free. It's often, improving biological health will bring in phosphorus for us. We never put for phosphorus. We've been trying to grow soil with very minimal inputs here. So it was just using grazing as our tool. So we've pushed the envelope a bit, but we've seen phosphorus levels increase with no phosphorus fertilizers in our soils over time. They're still not where we want them, but our soils are inherently low in that. And so we're just trying to work within the capacity of our soil. But it's exciting when you see that biology are bringing these things in, and it can happen. But when we're trying to manage the financial implications of that, sometimes we still need to use a bit of phosphorus in our system, but it's how we do it. Buffering fertilizers with humates means that we can foster the mycorrhizal fungi and keep them in the system to do the job, or we can use some foliars. There's different ways we can get into that, but that's what I see when I look at phosphorus, lack of fungi. You also get a phosphorus buffering index, that PBI number down the bottom. That's what that's about. And I'll go through that in a second. But yeah, if you're looking at phosphorus, it's again all that physical health stuff: compaction, aeration, texture, organic matter, and mycorrhizal fungi, getting those plant roots out into the soil to bring the phosphorus back. And if you've been putting phosphorus on your soils for years, there's no doubt your soil could be hanging on to a fair bit of it that once you get the biology working, they can access. So that's pretty cool when that can happen. This phosphorus buffering index, that PBI on your test, have a look at that, because that's going to tell you how quickly that phosphorus that you apply will lock up or not. So if you've got a high number, it'll become unavailable to the plant fairly quickly. If it's low, it's going to be there longer. So on these tests, yours was pretty good. I think I've got it written down somewhere because I haven't got the test in front of me, but I'm pretty sure yours was in I think it was in the low range. So, you can have a look there and note that in your notes as you work through it. So that's what that means, and that's how to interpret it. And if you had a really high PBI, I'd be more inclined to be putting on foliars of phosphorus, or little bits regularly, not hitting it with big sledgehammers, like big amounts. I'd be little bits more regularly to try and get bang for your buck, if that's what you need to do, and if that's part of the strategy that you work out. Then I go through all the other elements, like none of them are more important than others. I went through nitrogen and phosphorus, particularly because they're big. They're very, big fertilizer uses in all types of systems is N and P. K also, potassium. But then it's just a matter of going through all these elements and having a look at your result versus the desired level, okay, and seeing how it rates. I put some desired levels in because I haven't given you any for calcium, mag, potassium down here. These are only for this soil test because they related to the CEC of this soil. Different soils will have different desired levels. But yeah, just to give you an idea so you can have a look and make some assessments of each of these elements. The potassium in these soils, where's that here, is quite high, up to 296. When is a high potassium, sometimes there's broadleaf weeds, and in grasslands particularly, you get a lot of fleabane when you get high potassium. So if you've got broadleaf weeds in this soil, that could be part of the reason. And also when your potassium is high, it can create a few issues with animal health because it does impact calcium and magnesium processes as well. And if you have, weeds like the broadleaf, like dandelions, fleabanes, again, keep an eye, that can be a potassium issue. The sulfur is often low in a lot of soils I see. It's commonly low, and that's because it's related to organic matter. And a lot of our soils, even when we've got a good reading for organic matter, it might not be cycling through that system. And that's the source of sulfur in the soil, is organic matter. When it's low, we often have external parasites on animals. It's a very commonly seen link in all the paddocks, all the places we've worked. But it's also impacting plant nutrition because sulfur is really crucial in so many functions in the plant. So, that's one that's really often very important to address, is sulfur. These levels here, the calcium's pretty good, magnesium pretty good. They're all like, there's no real deficiencies in these. So if you're again trying to address pH and you're throwing on lime, you've got plenty of calcium. It might be the fact that you need to get that calcium functional, because you can have good calcium and mag, but they might not be functional. And when they're not, they're signaling weeds as well. So, and also calcium is really important in the biology of the system, particularly fungi. It all goes together. So, you know, when calcium function's not working, you might have thistles growing, burrs, different plants like that. I call them castrals. I don't know what. Thorn apple, there's a few different names for that weed. It's my Northern New South Wales weed names, but you know, just different aspects. But calcium processes are often not working in many soils, and it's like it's there, but it's just not cycling through the system because we've accidentally taken the life out. So, you know, being mindful of that. And in sodium also, we want it to be not too high, or we do get issues. It's not an issue here. And again, you know, just looking at our levels, copper here seems quite high according to a desired level. If you have low copper and you're running livestock, you'll have internal parasite issues. I can almost put money on that. It's a huge one for internal parasites in animals. So it's something with that you can feed, you know, and so you got to be careful with copper. It can kill animals if you give them too much. So don't just go putting copper everywhere. But, and with any of these trace elements, so these ones in the bottom, copper, zinc, manganese, iron, and boron, they're trace elements. So addressing them can be important, but we have to be very careful because we only need small amounts. A little bit's good, more is not better. So being mindful with these. Of all the trace elements, they all have important roles. If you find in your soil test you're low in things, I'd suggest going and learning online about the different roles these elements play in your system. But one that you should always be really mindful of is boron, because if you've got calcium not functional, it can be that we haven't got enough boron. They work together, and I've seen many people put tons and tons of lime on, get no response, and they've got no boron, because boron and calcium work together. So you know, it's really important to address these things, but being careful, because if you put too much on, you can create disaster. So it's really working with people to get the rates right, the timing right, not overdo anything, but just knowing what they do. And Graham Sate from Nutritech Solutions has some really good information on his website on all of these elements. There's a whole thing on how to interpret soil tests. He also has a podcast that he often goes through. He did a really good one on boron a few months ago, but just a really good one. So if you want to understand what these things are doing in your soil, that's a great resource, his website and his podcast, to learn more about the elements. But I guess just quickly, I know conscious of time, it's always hard to know how long I'll talk for. I want you to get that this is a diagnostic tool. We need to understand our soil's characteristics, and it's taking that holistic view. So how do we use these numbers? We monitor changes over time, okay? We remember to look at our physical and biological health. We always treat the whole patient, not just those numbers on the sheet of paper. It's like if you went to a doctor and they never ever physically saw you, they only saw your blood test. They're not going to they might miss stuff. They might not take your pulse. They might not listen to your heart. You know, they might not look in your eyes to check that you're okay. If they were just looking at your blood test, they might not diagnose effectively. And it's the same with our soil test. Yet that's what we've been doing. It's just kind of weird, isn't it, really, when you think of it like that? So the lab tests are about also looking at our observation of that soil. Is it aerated? Is water absorbing? You know, what's going on? And we also frequently take leaf tests because they add a dimension. They can tell us, yes, this is what's in our soil, but we want to know what the plant can access. What can the plant get? And it's frequent that they can't access the nutrients that are in excess in the soil, or vice versa, something we're missing in the soil, but the plant's fine because there's biology helping it get what it needs. So we look at leaf tests alongside our soil tests, and we also take soil microbial tests so we know what the bacteria, fungi, protozoa and things are doing. We set up a monitoring site like this. This is Angus, my trusty helper, and one of our clients doing some soil monitoring. And we come back to that same site over time. We look at the physical health, the minerals, the biology, and we take tons of photos. You know, to process. We look at what is your vision for your soil. Where are we now? Is the monitoring, and this is the soil test. Where are we now? It's a snapshot in time. And then we use all of those to sort of go through this process of monitoring. And it's a process, you know. Basically, keep going. One snapshot in time is not going to tell you which direction your system's going. So, you know, we want to know the trend. Are you going forward or backward? And the more you monitor, the better it gets, the more valuable it gets. You know which direction you're going in. I really believe if we measure once, we are wasting our time if we don't come back and do it again. But, you know, keep going, keep looking at it. I guess I'm just skipping through these because of time, but you can have these to read later if I give you the slides. But just to see, you know, having half the battle is keeping the records of all this stuff. Like if you go out and do some physical monitoring and take photos, it does take a bit of time to organize your records and be able to come back. There's apps you can use. There's even photo apps now that clients have showed me there. It puts a GPS point and a date and time on each photo they take so they can come back and find them. So there is ways we can do that. Don't let that stop you, but we want to know, is it going forwards or backwards? We look at, in the physical soil health, we're going to look at slaking, water infiltration, weeds, and, you know, and score the soil health so we can see how it's going, okay? And some of that looks a bit like this. We're out in the field with some clients here. It's always Angus in the photo because I'm always behind the camera with some of our clients, looking at soil structure, porosity. We look at compaction, how the plant roots growing. Are we finding any earthworms? Get a bit excited when we do, actually. What else can we find in that soil? We take photos of the soil profile. This is a very high magnesium, high clay, compacted soil, but we take a photo of that and we'll take those over time so we can see what we're looking at. How's the water going? Is it getting in the soil? Like if we don't look at these things alongside those soil tests, we miss these problems. Soils that do not absorb water. If we don't look at the slaking, we miss that problem. You know, we also look at plant roots, and we love to take photos of riser sheaths on plant roots. These ones are quite bare, but look at these good ones here. And I have to tell the story of this oat plant. This is Nicole Masters, who some of you may or may not have heard of, who I've done some work with. And we were doing some workshops around the place here in about 2018, it's a few years ago now. And this oat plant had actually been to a workshop a month earlier with Christine Jones, and people were very proud. It had a beautiful rhizo sheath, if not the best photo of it. But it came to the workshop, sat in the bucket all day. We all admired the beautiful soil biology that had created this beautiful rhizo sheath around these roots for the day. It had its photo taken with Christine, and the guys took it home and put it in their garden. And then a month later, they brought the exact same plant back to this workshop with Nicole. It was still alive. It's been 2 days out of the soil, but the rhizo sheath and all that biology was protecting that plant. It became known as Otis. It got quite famous because it was healthy. It had biology around its roots. What other plant could sit out of the soil for a couple of days at workshops and go home and keep growing? Like, really pretty amazing stuff. So this is what else we look at, not just the soil test numbers. And again, as I said, we add the plant tissue tests and we look at the life in the equation, because you need microbes to access the minerals. You know, they go hand in hand, and we've just forgotten, like we just took our eye off the ball. So now it's about refocusing. Now we know better, we can do better, and we can bring life back into that equation. A soil food web analysis will give you measures of bacteria, fungi, the ratios they have, whether you've got protozoa and nematodes and mycorrhizal fungi, and that's really useful to know. And we take all of these tests together, not just one, and that's how we work out our plan, I guess. I'm just conscious of the time, and I'm going to skip through a little bit to think about, you know, before we go to questions, if we're going to take strategic actions to address our soil health and use those soil tests you've got as part of that, then this is what we've got to think about. We look at also these minerals are this part of the equation, but we also need to consider our microbes, our organic matter, our management, and our mindset. So all of those things go into improving our soil health, and our minerals are part of it, okay? So they're important, but they're not the only thing we need to look at when we look at soil health. This is how we prioritize when we work with our clients. And this is a process Nicole outlines in her book, and one that we put into practice every single time we work with a client. If we're looking at a strategy for our soil, the first thing is, are we capturing solar energy? That's because that drives that carbon cycle that builds the soil organic matter in our soil that improves air and water. And they're the next three things. If you want a living, healthy soil and it has no air, how long can anything live without air? We wouldn't be here very long if we put our hand over our mouth and nose. We couldn't exist without breathing. And it's the same with life in our soil, the same with water. So that's why we need that carbon cycle working first. Then we go decomposition functioning. That's what I talked about, that carbon to nitrogen ratio and why we look at it. Then we go, how's the biology going? We might address that. We might feed some biology next. And then we look at the minerals. So in traditional ag, we've been trained to look only at minerals and go, here's our soil test, what do we put on? But we're missing all the foundations. Like, minerals are important, but if we don't address the free stuff that nature provides first, we're just on a never-ending input treadmill, going round and round on inputs. But if we want to get off that cycle, we need to address these foundations first. Biology can also be an input cycle if we're not careful, if we don't keep it alive in the system. But when we address the foundations, we're more likely to keep our biology alive and doing the work for us that cycles the minerals, and we can just tweak them as we go, but rather than just focusing here. So that's where the soil test fits. It's still important, but it's like, how do we, address the whole health of the soil? We need to take into account all of those aspects. So that's pretty much it. I did race through a few slides at the end, but if you noticed anything there that piqued your curiosity, ask me some questions, and I might stop sharing my screen and go from there. That was a quick whistle-top tour of a soil test.